The man didn't even look at the baby. He looked at Eliza's worn boots, at the carpet bag she was gripping so hard her knuckles had gone white, at the sky behind her darkening the way skies in Wyoming darkened before they tried to kill you. Then he looked back at her face, and whatever softness might have lived in him once had long since been pressed out like water from a wrung rag. "The advertisement said cook," Silas Granger said. "It didn't say anything about that." He said that the way other men said problem, the way men said burden. He said it without flinching, without lowering his voice, without so much as glancing at the 8-month-old girl bundled against Eliza's chest, the child who had done nothing in her short life except lose every person she was supposed to be able to count on. Eliza had ridden 14 hours in an open wagon to get here. She had buried her sister 9 days ago in frozen ground she had to break with a pickaxe because nobody else would help her. She had exactly 73 cents, a baby who needed milk by morning, and a storm coming in behind her so fast she could already smell the iron in it. And this man, this tall, stone-faced rancher standing in his own doorway, had just called the most important person in her world that. If you were standing in her boots right now, what would you do? If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, don't go anywhere. Subscribe right now and follow Eliza all the way to the end, because where she goes from this doorstep will surprise you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Eliza Rowan to the edge of Silas Granger's property didn't wait for her to change her mind. Old Pete Calloway, who had driven her the last 40 miles from Burnt Creek for the price of a promise that she would send him a jar of blackberry preserves come summer, pulled his horses to a stop at the fork in the road where the Granger Ranch sign hung crooked on its post. He helped her down with one hand and handed her the carpet bag with the other. He didn't get out. He didn't say much. He was 71 years old and had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognize when a sky was finished making decisions. "You got maybe 2 hours," he said, looking at the clouds. "Maybe less." "I know," Eliza said. "Ranch house is down that road about a quarter mile. Can't miss it." "Thank you, Pete." He looked at Rosie, who was awake and chewing on the corner of her blanket with the complete seriousness of someone who had important business to attend to. He looked at Eliza. His face did the thing old men's faces do when they want to say something they've decided not to say. "You're a stubborn woman," he told her. "Yes," she agreed. He clicked his tongue at the horses and was gone before she finished turning around. Eliza stood there for a moment with the wind picking up around her boots and Rosie's small, warm weight against her chest and the carpet bag in her hand. She had packed that bag 4 times before she got it right. First too heavy, then too light. Then she'd taken out the extra dress and replaced it with the cooking knives because a woman could wear the same dress 2 days, but she couldn't cook a decent meal without her own knives. Her sister Clara had laughed at that. "You'd trade your last petticoat for a good paring knife," Clara had said. "You absolutely would." Clara had been right. Clara had also been 26 years old and dead of fever for 9 days now, which was the kind of fact that still arrived in Eliza's chest like a fist whenever she let her guard down even slightly. She didn't let her guard down now. She walked. The quarter-mile felt longer with the wind against her and Rosie starting to fuss in that low preliminary way that meant she was hungry and was giving fair warning before escalating to something that could not be described as fair. Eliza bounced her as she walked. "I know," she said quietly. "I know, sweetheart. Just a little farther." Rosie was not convinced, but she accepted the negotiation. The ranch house came into view just as the first serious gust hit. The kind that didn't push you, it redirected you, and Eliza leaned into it and kept moving. The house was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand, not by any measure, but solid in the way that things built to survive are solid. A long porch across the front. 2 outbuildings she could see and probably more she couldn't. Smoke coming from the chimney, which meant fire, which meant heat, which meant the most essential thing she needed for Rosie right now was already present in that building. She knocked on the door. Knocked like she had every right to, because she had answered an advertisement in good faith and traveled 14 hours, and that was a reasonable thing to knock on a door about. The man who opened it was not what she'd imagined. She had imagined a rancher. What she got was something closer to what happened when a rancher stopped bothering to be anything else. Silas Granger was somewhere in his late 30s probably, though the lines around his eyes suggested his years had weighed more than average. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who had answered this door expecting something other than what was standing on his porch. "Mr. Granger," she said, "my name is Eliza Rowan. I answered your advertisement in the Burnt Creek Gazette. Cook. 3 meals daily, Sunday mornings light. I've been cooking professionally for 11 years. I can provide references from—" "The advertisement said cook," he said. His eyes had dropped to Rosie. Something went tight in Eliza's chest. Not fear. She'd had enough fear in the last 2 weeks to recognize it precisely, and this wasn't it. This was something older and angrier than fear. "Yes," she said carefully, "it did. It didn't say anything about that." And there it was. That. Spoken with such complete flatness, such total absence of cruelty, but also absence of anything else, as if Rosie were a piece of furniture she'd neglected to mention. Eliza felt the anger move through her like a current, and she held absolutely still and let it pass because she had no room for anger right now, no room for the luxury of it. "Her name is Rosie," Eliza said. "She's 8 months old, she sleeps through the night, she doesn't cry unless she's hungry or needs changing, and she requires nothing from you or your ranch except the space to exist quietly while I do the job I was hired to do." "You weren't hired," Silas said. "I placed an advertisement." "Then consider this my interview." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him she could hear the low sound of men's voices. The ranch hands, probably, somewhere in the depths of the house or just beyond it. She could smell coffee, the real kind, not the weak brown water some people served as a kindness. She could feel the warmth from inside the doorway reaching out toward her and toward Rosie, and she wanted it so badly she had to concentrate very carefully on her face to keep any of that wanting from showing. "I run a working cattle ranch," Silas said. 12 men, meals at 5:30 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. That kitchen isn't a place for an infant. I'll keep her out of the way during meal preparation. And when she cries, when she needs feeding, when she's sick, I'll manage it." "You'll manage it," he repeated. And the way he said it wasn't mockery exactly, but it was close enough to make her jaw tighten. "Mr. Granger," she kept her voice even. Not soft. Soft would be begging, and she wasn't going to beg. Just even. "There's a storm coming. I can see it the same as you can see it. I'm asking for 1 night of shelter, nothing more. If you wake up tomorrow morning and decide I'm not suitable, I will leave without argument, but tonight I need to get this child inside." Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it. He was the kind of man who had spent years making sure things didn't move across his face where other people could see them. He stepped back from the doorway. Not warmly. Not with any invitation in his posture. He simply stepped back, which created a space she could walk through, and Eliza walked through it. The kitchen was at the back of the house. He showed her to it without speaking, with the particular silence of a man who hadn't changed his mind, so much as temporarily suspended it, and she understood that this silence was not permission, it was a pause. She had until morning to turn the pause into something permanent. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at what she had to work with. It was a disaster. Not dirty exactly. Someone had been cleaning it after a fashion. But it was the kitchen of a house that had forgotten what kitchens were for. The stove needed blacking. The shelves were poorly organized in a way that added 10 unnecessary minutes to every meal. The larder held reasonable supplies but without any logic to their arrangement, and she could see from the state of the pots that whoever had been cooking was either very bad at it or very tired of doing it, or both. Rosie made a sound of escalating urgency. Eliza set down the carpet bag, shifted Rosie into a better position, found the small wrapped cloth of dampened bread she used to quiet the baby's hunger in emergencies, and offered it to her while she opened the carpet bag with her other hand and began taking out her knives. She had 2 hours before the storm hit. She needed to make something tonight that would still be talked about tomorrow morning. She had cooked under worse pressure. She started with the onions. Not because onions were glamorous, but because onions changed a room. The smell of onions and butter in a hot pan was the smell of intention, of someone who meant to feed you and had opinions about how it should be done. Within 10 minutes, the kitchen smelled different. Within 20, she heard boots on the wooden floor of the hallway outside and then stop, The way boots stop when the person wearing them has suddenly encountered something unexpected. She didn't look up. She heard the footsteps move away. Rosie had fallen asleep on the folded blanket Eliza had positioned in the corner farthest from the stove, warm enough to be comfortable, far enough to be safe. The girl slept the way she did most things, with complete commitment, both small fists curled beside her face like she was prepared to negotiate even in dreams. The storm hit at 10 minutes past 8. Eliza heard it arrive against the walls of the house, the sound of something enormous deciding it had waited long enough. The windows rattled. Somewhere outside, something metallic clanged and was silent. The ranch hands who had been in the bunkhouse came thundering across the yard in the last possible minute, and then the front door crashed open and a rush of cold and noise and wet came in with them, followed by the sounds of 7 grown men all trying to be inside at the same time. She heard Silas's voice from somewhere in the front of the house. Not shouting, but carrying, the voice of a man who expected to be heard the first time. Doors opened and closed. Boots hit floors. The storm pressed against the house and the house pushed back. Eliza brought the stew to the table. She hadn't made an elaborate production of it. There was stew, there was fresh bread that had been possible because whoever had stocked this kitchen had kept good flour, even if they hadn't known what to do with it. And there was coffee that she had made the correct way, which was strong enough to hold your attention and not so bitter it punished you for drinking it. She stood back from the table because the kitchen wasn't large and there were 12 men plus Silas filing into it, and they came in with all the noise and cold smell of men who had been doing physical work in dangerous weather, and they stopped when they saw the food. It was a very particular kind of stopping, not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "Who made this?" said a man at the back, younger than the others, with red hair and mud on his left boot from the ankle down. "The woman," said the man in front of him. This produced a silence. "Well," said the red-haired man, reaching for a bowl. "All right then." She watched them eat. She always watched the first time. It was how you learned what people actually needed as opposed to what they said they needed. The older man in the corner, she'd learned later his name was Hank, that he'd been on this ranch 14 years, that his knees were going and he kept it to himself. He ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned not to trust that food would always be there. The younger ones ate fast and too much, and she'd have to recalibrate portions tomorrow. One man barely touched the bread, which meant either he couldn't tolerate wheat or he was sick, and she made a note of it. Silas Granger sat at the head of the table and ate without comment. She wouldn't have known what he thought of it except that he had 2 bowls, and he was not a man who struck her as someone who did anything without reason. When the table was cleared and the washing done, and the last cowboy had gone back to the bunkhouse through the howling dark, Eliza dried her hands on her apron and turned around to find Silas Granger standing in the kitchen doorway. He was looking at Rosie, still asleep in her corner, then at Eliza, then at the kitchen in a way that suggested the kitchen surprised him more than he wanted it to. "You didn't ask where you'd sleep," he said. "I figured I'd ask once I'd made myself less easy to turn away," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't entirely read. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Small, fireplace works. You can have it until morning." "And after morning?" Another pause. Outside, the storm was doing what Wyoming storms did, which was everything. "After morning," he said. "We'll see." He left without further comment. Eliza stood in the warm kitchen that had been cold a few hours ago, listening to Rosie breathe in the corner, listening to the storm try to get through the walls, and she thought about Clara. About the way Clara used to say that Eliza never knew when she was beaten. She thought maybe Clara was right about that too. She picked up Rosie, who stirred but didn't wake, and carried her to the small room off the kitchen. The fireplace did work. She laid the baby down and sat beside her on the narrow bed, and pressed her forehead to Rosie's soft one, and stayed like that for a while in the dark, not praying, just breathing. Morning would come. Morning always came. And when it did, Eliza Rowan intended to already have the coffee on. She was awake at 4 o'clock. She hadn't meant to sleep and she had slept anyway, which annoyed her, but 4 o'clock was still workable. She moved carefully so she wouldn't wake Rosie, wrapped the child in both blankets and positioned her safely, and went to the kitchen. There was no lantern lit. She didn't need one. She had walked that kitchen in her head all night, and she knew where everything was, or where it should be, or where she would move it to. She had the fire going in the stove before 4:30. She had biscuits started, real ones, not the flat, hard things she suspected these men had been eating, by 5. She had bacon going and eggs ready and a second pot of coffee by 5:25. At 5:30 on the exact minute, the first ranch hand came through the kitchen door and stopped so fast the man behind him walked into him. The smell hit them both. "Is that—" the second man started. "Biscuits," the first man said, as if he were identifying something he hadn't seen in a very long time and wanted to be sure he was right. "Those are actual biscuits." They sat down. They ate. More men came. The kitchen was too small for all of them, and they stood where they had to stand and nobody complained, which Eliza understood was significant. These were men who complained. That was part of what men did when they spent too much time in close quarters and hard work. They complained, and the fact that they weren't doing it now meant something. Silas came in at 5:40. He was already dressed for work, already had the look of someone who had been awake longer than sleep should allow. He poured himself coffee from the pot, took a single sip, and looked at the mug with a slight narrowing of his eyes. He didn't say anything, but he didn't pour it out, and men who drink bad coffee every day know immediately when someone has made it correctly. He sat down. He ate his biscuits. He listened to his ranch hands talk around him with a looseness in their voices that probably hadn't been there yesterday morning. And when he stood to leave, he stopped beside Eliza, who was at the stove and did not turn around. "3 meals a day," he said. "Sunday mornings you cook, but it's lighter. Room off the kitchen is yours, $12 a month." She kept her eyes on the pan in front of her. 13, she said. "I was already going to save you money on the provisions because you've been buying wrong. 13 for that." A silence. "Fine," he said. He left. Eliza let out a breath she had been holding since 4 o'clock that morning, or possibly since the moment 9 days ago, when she'd stood at her sister's grave in frozen ground and made a promise to a baby who couldn't understand it. From the corner of the kitchen, Rosie had woken up. She was lying on her back in the blanket nest, looking at the ceiling with the philosophical interest of someone encountering a new ceiling for the first time. Then she made a small sound, a quiet syllable of observation, and turned her head and found Eliza's face. She smiled. Not at everything that had happened or everything that was still coming, just the smile of a baby who had looked up and found the face she needed to find. Eliza smiled back, even though her eyes were doing something she preferred they didn't do, and turned back to the stove. There was breakfast to finish. There was lunch to plan. There were 12 men and a difficult rancher to feed, and a child to raise, and a place to build for them both in a house that had not been a home in a very long time. She had work to do, so she did it. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons Eliza had expected. She had expected resistance from the ranch hands. She had expected cold shoulders and quiet resentment, and the particular brand of suspicion that men developed toward anyone new who arrived and started changing things. She had expected to earn her place the slow, difficult way, meal by meal, day by day, with no shortcuts and no grace period. What she hadn't expected was Hank. Hank Delroy was 54 years old and had the posture of a man who had been told his whole life to straighten up and had decided at some point that the people telling him that could mind their own business. He was the oldest hand on the Granger Ranch, which gave him a status that wasn't official, but was completely understood by everyone, including Silas. And on the third morning, he came into the kitchen at 4:55, 25 minutes before breakfast, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched her work without saying anything. Eliza let him watch. She had been watched before. After about 4 minutes, he said, "You salt the water before or after it boils?" "After," she said. "Before is a waste." He made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement. Clara Osgood used to cook for a ranch over in Powder River. She salted before. "Clara Osgood can salt whenever she likes," Eliza said. "I salt after." Another silence. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. "Coffee's better than it was," he said. "That's because I'm not boiling it to death," she said. "You were boiling it. Coffee doesn't need to be punished, it needs to be respected." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize as the Hank Delroy version of being amused. Then he sat down at the table and picked up the mug she had already poured for him. She'd noticed on day one that he came in early, she'd had it ready. And he drank it in silence. That was the beginning of something, though she couldn't have said what exactly. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the larder 3 times, negotiated a better arrangement with the supply man who came out from Burnt Creek on Thursdays, discovered that one of the younger hands, named Tommy Briggs, couldn't eat onions without getting sick and had been quietly not eating half his meals rather than say so, and learned that the ranch had a cat that nobody had officially claimed but that lived in the barn and had apparently been receiving secret donations of kitchen scraps from at least 4 different cowboys who each believed they were the only one doing it. She also learned that Silas Granger went to the south pasture every evening, alone, around the time the lights started going. She learned this because the kitchen window faced south, and because she had eyes. She didn't ask about it. Some things you didn't ask about in the first week. Rosie, for her part, was conducting her own campaign. It was not strategic. Rosie was 8 months old and incapable of strategy. But there was something about a baby in a place that had been entirely without babies that operated on men in a way Eliza found almost scientific in its consistency. They would come into the kitchen for coffee and find Rosie propped against the cushion Eliza had fashioned for her, looking at the world with those serious dark eyes of hers, and they would stop. Just stop, the way you stop when you see something that doesn't fit your expectations of a place. The first one to crack was a hand named Dooley, who was 22 and from somewhere in Kansas and had the general energy of a person who had been too far from home for too long. He came in on the 4th day for his noon coffee, saw Rosie on the cushion, crouched down in front of her with his hat in his hands, and said very quietly, "Hey there." Rosie examined him. She took her time about it. Then she reached out and grabbed his index finger with both her hands. Dooley looked up at Eliza with an expression that was half alarm and half something else entirely. "She does that," Eliza said. "She's strong," he said, sounding surprised. "Yes." He stayed crouched there for another minute, letting the baby hold his finger, looking at her face with the expression of someone remembering something. Then he stood up carefully, put his hat back on, and went out without his coffee. He came back 30 seconds later, got the coffee, and left again without making eye contact with anyone. Hank, watching from the corner, said nothing. But he was looking at the door Dooley had just gone through with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. The trouble started on a Tuesday. A woman named Mrs. Aldrich came to the ranch with her husband, who had some business with Silas about fence lines and grazing rights. Eliza didn't know who they were when they arrived. She heard the wagon, heard voices on the porch, heard Silas's measured tones and a man's voice responding. She was rolling out dough for the midday meal, and she kept working. Then she heard the woman's voice, and then she heard very clearly through the not very thick walls of the ranch house the words unmarried woman and that child in the same sentence, spoken with the particular tonal precision of someone who wants to make sure they're understood. Her hands stopped moving on the dough. She heard Silas say something she couldn't make out, his voice lower than usual. The woman's voice again. Sets a bad example in what people will say. Eliza picked up the rolling pin and kept working. Her jaw was tight enough that she was going to have a headache by afternoon if she wasn't careful, and she breathed deliberately through her nose and rolled the dough and reminded herself that Mrs. Aldrich's opinions were not her problem. People had been having opinions about Eliza her whole life. She was still here. What she didn't expect was Silas walking into the kitchen 20 minutes later with a look on his face like he'd bitten into something unpleasant. He stood there for a moment. She kept working. "The Aldriches are staying for the midday meal," he said. "I figured," she said. "There's enough." He didn't leave. She looked up. He was looking at the dough, or at the counter, or at something near the dough and counter that wasn't exactly either of those things. "She said something," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. "She said several things." "And what did you tell her?" A pause. "I told her that my kitchen arrangements were my own business." Something in Eliza's chest loosened slightly, though she didn't let it show. "Was that enough for her?" "No," he said. "But it was enough for me." He left. Eliza looked at the dough for a moment, then at Rosie in her corner, then back at the dough. She rolled it harder than strictly necessary for the next few minutes, and then she got herself back under control, and she made a lunch that was the best thing she had produced since she'd arrived, Because if Mrs. Aldrich was going to sit at that table and eat, she was going to eat food that Eliza Rowan had made with full and complete competence, and she was going to know it. Mrs. Aldrich ate 2 servings of the potato soup and didn't say a word to Eliza directly. When they left, Eliza watched from the kitchen window without appearing to watch, and she saw Silas stand on the porch until their wagon was out of sight. His posture was the same as always, straight and unreadable, but his arms were crossed, and she had learned enough about Silas Granger in a week to know that he crossed his arms when something was bothering him that he had decided not to say out loud. She turned back to the kitchen. There was always more to do. The weeks moved the way work makes weeks move, fast at the front end, slow at the back, and then suddenly gone. October settled over the ranch with its particular combination of beauty and malice, clear blue days that made you believe in things, and cold nights that reminded you not to. Eliza learned the rhythms of the place, learned which men needed what and when, learned the particular complaints of the stove in cold mornings, and the way the water pump behaved when the temperature dropped. She also learned Silas Granger in the careful sideways way you learned a man who did not intend to be learned. He ate the same amount every meal, no more, no less, which meant either he had iron self-discipline or he had long since stopped eating for pleasure and was doing it purely as maintenance. He was up before anyone else and in bed last. He worked harder than men 20 years younger than him, which she suspected he did, partly because the ranch required it, and partly because a body kept busy this way had less room for other things. He had a slight hesitation before he spoke that was so habitual she almost stopped noticing it. A pause of maybe 1 second, like he was checking whatever he was about to say against something internal before allowing it out. She didn't know what had made him this way. She knew something had. You didn't get that careful about yourself without reason. Hank told her, eventually. Not because she asked, she was careful not to ask, but because Hank was the kind of man who decided when information needed to move and moved it accordingly. It was a Thursday evening, late, after the supper dishes were done. Rosie was asleep. Eliza was sitting at the kitchen table doing the week's accounts, which she had taken over partly because Silas had asked her to help track the provisions, and partly because the previous system had involved scraps of paper in 3 different pockets and was an accountant's nightmare. Hank came in for water, and instead of leaving with it, he sat down. He had a wife, Hank said without preamble. Eliza looked up. Margaret, she was... He stopped. She was something. I don't have a better word for it. She came out here when this place was barely standing, and she made it work, same as you're making it work, except she did it with less to work with. He drank his water. She died 4 years ago. Fever took her fast. Took the baby, too. Eliza was quiet for a moment. He doesn't talk about it. No. Does he talk about anything? Hank considered this seriously. He talks about cattle, he said, and fence lines, and what needs doing. He set down his glass. He used to talk more, before. She looked at the accounts in front of her without seeing them. Outside, the wind had picked up, doing its preliminary Wyoming thing where it reminded you what was coming, even when what was coming was still weeks away. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Hank was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because you're not going to figure out how to handle that man if you don't understand what broke him. He got up and left. Eliza sat with that for a while. She hadn't come here to handle Silas Granger. She had come here to cook and to keep Rosie safe and to build something stable out of the wreckage that the last 2 months had made of her life. She had not come here to understand a grieving rancher or repair whatever was fractured in him, and she was very clear about this in her own head, very deliberate, to feel any particular way about the man who paid her wages. But understanding was different from feeling. Understanding was just information, and she was a practical woman. She went back to the accounts. The incident with the broken shelf happened on a Wednesday. It was one of the kitchen shelves, the one that held the heavier pots, and it had been poorly attached to the wall for probably longer than Eliza had been there. And on a Wednesday morning when she was moving a cast iron pan, it finally gave way. The pan came down, the shelf came down, 2 other pots came down, and the noise was substantial. It wasn't dangerous, but Rosie was across the room and Eliza stepped back fast enough. But the pots were on the floor and the shelf was in pieces, and she was in the middle of morning meal preparation with about 40 minutes until she needed food on the table. She got the pots back where they needed to be, she improvised shelf space on the counter, she got the meal out on time. Nobody went hungry. The broken shelf she stacked in the corner to deal with later. When she came back to the kitchen after lunch, the shelf was fixed. Not patched, not temporarily propped. Fixed properly, with new hardware, mounted level and solid against the wall. There was no note. Nobody said anything about it. When she looked at the ranch hands at the evening meal, none of them would know anything about it. She had spent enough time reading the faces of 12 cowboys to know when they were concealing something and when they genuinely didn't. She looked at Silas. He was eating. His face was doing its usual thing, which was nothing in particular. She didn't say anything. What would she say? Thank you for fixing my shelf would require acknowledging that he had done it, which would require him to have either admitted it or denied it, and either of those seemed like they would cost him something he hadn't decided to spend. So she said nothing. She just knew. That was the beginning of a different kind of noticing. The firewood. She had been bringing in her own firewood for the kitchen hearth, which was fine. It was part of the work, but the woodpile she had to walk to was on the far side of the yard, and on cold mornings it added time. One morning she walked out to get wood at 4:30 and found a neat stack of it already beside the kitchen door. Nobody claimed it. It was just there. The next time Rosie got a cold, a real one, not the minor sniffles of the week before, but the kind that made her feverish and restless and hard to settle. Eliza was up most of the night with her and came to the kitchen the next morning with the specific look of someone who has not slept and knows it shows and doesn't have the energy to pretend otherwise. She was making coffee when she heard a knock at the kitchen door, the outside one, and found Silas on the other side of it holding a small cloth bag. "What's this?" she said. "Eucalyptus and dried thyme," he said. "You put it in hot water and let her breathe the steam. 15 minutes. It'll help with the congestion." She looked at the bag. "Where did you get this?" "Made it." She looked up. He had already turned to go. "Silas?" He stopped. "Thank you," she said. A pause. Not the normal one. Longer. "It's just herbs," he said, and went back across the yard in the 4:30 dark. Eliza stood in the doorway holding the cloth bag and looking at the space where he'd been for probably longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went in and made the steam and held Rosie over it with a towel draped over both their heads, and Rosie found it deeply objectionable for exactly 2 minutes and then fell asleep. And by morning, her breathing was easier. It was just herbs. She knew that. November arrived. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms, which were harder and quieter and more internal than the fall. The men spent more hours inside in the evenings, and the kitchen became a gathering point in a way it hadn't been before. Or at least that was what Hank told her. That before, men ate and left. That there hadn't been any reason to linger. Now they lingered. Dooley had taken to reading aloud from whatever book or paper he could get his hands on, and nobody told him to stop, which she took as a sign of genuine contentment rather than just tolerance. Rosie was pulling herself upright now, gripping whatever furniture presented itself and hauling herself to standing with an expression of absolute determination that made the cowboys openly laugh, which startled her every time and then made her laugh too, which made them laugh harder. It was during one of these evenings that Tommy Briggs, the one who couldn't eat onions, who had been eating full meals now that she'd sorted his without making a production of it, said, without particularly addressing anyone, "This is the best it's been here in a long time." Nobody argued with him. Eliza, washing up at the sink with her back to the room, said nothing. But she was smiling at the window in the dark. The hard moment came from outside, as hard moments often do. A woman from town, not Mrs. Aldrich this time, a different one, a Mrs. Pierce who had more confidence than sense and more opinions than either, arrived at the ranch one Thursday afternoon while Silas was out and several of the hands were in the near pasture, which left Eliza essentially alone with Rosie and Hank, who was fixing a harness in the barn. Mrs. Pierce came to the door and Eliza opened it. "You're the cook," the woman said. "Yes," Eliza said. "The unmarried one." She said it like it was a classification, like Eliza was a species being identified. "Yes," Eliza said again, same tone, same face. And the child. Mrs. Pierce was looking past her at Rosie, who was on the floor engaged with a wooden spoon she had confiscated some time ago and now considered property. Whose is she? Mine, Eliza said. Your natural child? She's mine, Eliza said. That's all. Mrs. Pierce looked at her with the expression of someone who found the answer insufficient. People talk, you know. A woman in this situation, living among men, no husband. Mrs. Pierce, Eliza said, I have bread in the oven and a child to watch and 3 hours until I need to have supper ready for 12 working men. I don't have time for what people say. She paused. Was there something you needed, or did you come here specifically for this conversation? The woman blinked. She was not accustomed to being addressed that way. Eliza could see her deciding whether to be offended or to respect it, and it went back and forth for a moment, and then Mrs. Pierce did something Eliza hadn't expected. She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her. You're very direct, she said. I try to be, Eliza said. It saves time. Mrs. Pierce looked at her for another moment. Then she looked at Rosie, who had looked up from the wooden spoon to examine the visitor with the focused attention she gave new people. She's a pretty child, Mrs. Pierce said, and it sounded almost genuine. Yes, Eliza agreed. She is. The woman left. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched her go, and then leaned against the doorframe and felt the particular exhaustion of having to be sturdy all the time, of never being able to put it down. It wasn't the conversation that was tiring. She'd had worse conversations. It was the accumulation of them, the daily ongoing requirement of defending the legitimacy of her presence in the world, of Rosie's presence in the world. She was still standing there when she heard boots behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, Silas was there. He had come in through the kitchen door from the yard. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning, slowly, to read. I saw her wagon leaving, he said. Mrs. Pierce, yes. What did she want? Nothing useful. Eliza pushed off the doorframe and went back toward the kitchen. I need to check the bread. He didn't follow her immediately. When he came into the kitchen, he poured himself coffee and stood with his back against the counter, watching her check the bread with the expression he sometimes got when he was deciding whether to say something. There's going to be more of that, he said. I know. It's not... He stopped. The 1-second pause. It's not right that you have to deal with it. She looked up from the oven. It was not the kind of thing she had expected him to say. She could see it had cost him a small amount to say it. Not the sentiment. She thought he meant the sentiment genuinely, but the saying of it, the making it audible. No, she agreed. It's not right, but it's what is. She looked at him carefully. Does it bother you, what they say? The pause again. Yes, he said. Just that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the bread, because there was nothing to do with that answer except receive it, and she had received it. And the bread needed to come out now before it overdid the bottom. It's ready, she said, about the bread. All right, he said, about something that wasn't the bread. He put the coffee mug down and went out, and Eliza stood in the warm kitchen with the smell of bread and the baby on the floor and the sound of men working outside, and she thought about what Hank had told her about what broke people, and she thought about herself, and she thought that maybe the difference between a person who stayed broken and a person who didn't had something to do with whether they found a reason to keep showing up in the morning. She had a reason. She had the best reason possible, currently conducting experiments with a wooden spoon in the corner. She started the supper. Outside, the Wyoming sky was doing what Wyoming skies did this time of year, which was remind you that it had been generous so far, but that its patience was not unlimited, and that winter was not a possibility but a certainty, and that the only question was whether you would be ready when it came. Eliza intended to be ready. She had been ready for everything else so far, more or less. She had not been graceful about all of it. She had cried once in the small room off the kitchen at midnight with her face in a pillow so no one could hear, over Clara, over all of it, over the sheer weight of the ongoing requirement of not giving up. She had burned the stew on a Tuesday when she was too tired to watch it properly, and she had been short with Dooley one morning for no fault of his. and she had gone 3 days without speaking more than 10 words to anyone that weren't work-related because she didn't have any other words to spare. She was not perfect. She had never claimed to be. But she was there, every morning at 4 o'clock, with the fire going and the coffee on and something worth waking up for on the stove. And every morning, without fail, when the kitchen filled up with cold and noise and the smell of men coming in from the dark, Rosie woke up in her corner and looked around at all of them with those serious wide eyes like she was taking attendance, making sure everyone was accounted for, making sure they were all still there. She always seemed satisfied with what she found. Eliza understood that. She was starting to feel it herself. December came in like a door being kicked open. Not gradually, not with the polite warning of a few cold days leading somewhere colder. Wyoming didn't work that way. The first real blizzard of the season arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sky had been perfectly clear the evening before, which was the kind of meteorological dishonesty that Eliza was still learning to account for. She had been up since 4 as always, had the stove going, had biscuits in the oven, and was watching through the kitchen window as the darkness outside went from black to a particular shade of gray that she was starting to recognize as meaning something serious was coming. By 5 o'clock, the snow was moving sideways. By 5:30, when the hands came in for breakfast, 3 of them had ice in their hair from the 20-yard walk between the bunkhouse and the main house. Dooley's eyelashes had actual frost on them, which he seemed to find more interesting than alarming. Tommy Briggs came in last, stomping snow off his boots with the vigor of someone arguing with the weather personally. "South fence is already drifting," he said to nobody in particular. Hank, already on his second coffee, said, "How bad?" "Bad enough." Silas came in from outside, not from the bunkhouse direction, but from farther out, which meant he had already been to assess something before most of the men were even awake. His coat was heavy with snow. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, not quite coming in all the way, looking at his hands as if they were telling him something. "Cattle in the north pasture need moving," he said, "before it gets worse." "It's already worse," said Hank. "Then before it gets worse than that." He looked at the room. "I need 6 men. Volunteers first." All 12 hands raised their hands, which said something about them, and Silas picked 6 of the steadiest, and they finished breakfast fast and went back out into it. Eliza watched them go from the window with a particular feeling she was not going to examine too closely, the feeling of watching people you had started to care about walk into something dangerous because the work required it. She made more coffee. She made extra food, things that would hold and reheat, things a cold man could eat fast and feel immediately. She kept the kitchen at the highest temperature the stove could reasonably produce. She did what she could do, which was this. By midday, the storm had become something else entirely. It stopped being weather and became a condition, the way some things stop being events and become the permanent state of affairs. The wind was loud enough that conversation required raising your voice. The visibility through the kitchen window had gone down to almost nothing. 3 of the men who had gone out came back early, one of them with the first signs of cold injury in his left hand, which Eliza dealt with efficiently and without drama, rewarming it properly while its owner, a barrel-chested man named Cutter, sat at the kitchen table looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who refused to acknowledge that he was relieved to be inside. The other 3 were still out. Silas was still out. By 3 o'clock, 2 more came back. By 3:30, Dooley came back alone, and the way he came back, fast, a little ragged, not stopping to shake the snow off at the door the way he normally would, made Eliza set down the pot she was holding. "Where's Silas?" she asked. Dooley looked at Hank, who had stayed in to manage the firewood, and to be the person who stayed in because someone with sense needed to do that. The look said something that his mouth was working up to. "He was right behind me," Dooley said. "He was. But there's a drift between the north gate and the ridge. It came up fast, and I thought he was—" He stopped. "I thought he was right behind me." Eliza was already moving toward the coats by the door. "You're not going out there," Hank said. "Someone has to," she said. "Not you." He was already standing. "I'll go. Cutter, you're in better shape than you look. Let's go." "His hand," Eliza started. "It's fine," Cutter said, standing up. He flexed it experimentally and made a face that suggested it was not entirely fine, but was functional enough. He went toward the north ridge, Dooley said, following the fence line. Hank and Cutter went out. Eliza stood in the kitchen and felt the cold come in with the opening of the door and felt it leave with the closing of it. and then stood in the suddenly quiet kitchen with Rosie on her hip and Dooley sitting at the table with his hands around a mug and the wind pressing against the walls with the sound of something that had no interest in whether any of them were all right. She put Rosie down. She checked the stove. She put water on for more coffee, for the hot water she would need for warming whoever came back, and in whatever state they came back. She moved around the kitchen doing these things, and she was doing them efficiently and without visible panic. But in the middle of getting the extra blankets from the chest in the hallway, she stopped for just a moment with the blankets in her arms, and she thought, very clearly, she thought, "Don't you dare." Not a request. Not exactly. More like a position statement. She went back to the kitchen. They came back 45 minutes later, all three of them, and Silas was between Hank and Cutter with his arm across Hank's shoulders and his feet moving but not quite right. And when they got him through the kitchen door and into the light, Eliza saw his face and felt her stomach drop. He was gray. Not pale. Gray, the color of a person whose body has made certain decisions about where to send the blood, and those decisions did not include the face. He was conscious, which was the first thing she assessed, but his eyes were not entirely tracking the way they should. "Get his coat off," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "He was down in the drift," Hank said, working at Silas's coat. "Maybe 20 minutes before we found him. He got and turned around." 20 minutes. She was calculating. "Is he talking?" "He talked some on the way back." "Silas." She got in front of him, put her hands on his face, tilted it down toward her. His skin was cold in a way that was deeper than surface cold. "Look at me." His eyes found her. It took a second, but they found her. "There she is," she said, and she heard something in her own voice she hadn't intended to put there. She moved on immediately. "Sit him down, not on the floor, on the chair. Keep his back straight. Dooley, I need the blankets from the hallway chest, the wool ones, all of them. Hank, I need you to get his boots off, and I need the water that's on the stove. Not hot, warm, you know the difference." They moved. She moved. The kitchen became organized chaos for about 4 minutes and then became organized because Eliza did not allow it to stay chaotic once she had assessed the situation and determined what needed doing. She did not rewarm him too fast. That was the thing people got wrong. The instinct to put a cold person next to direct heat, which was the wrong instinct, which caused damage. She knew this. She had learned it from her father, who had learned it from someone who had learned it the hard way. She rewarmed Silas Granger slowly and correctly, layer by layer, watching his color change back from gray to something more like himself, watching his eyes clear in his hands. His hands had been shaking without stopping since they got him inside. Slowly, slowly, steady down. At some point she realized that Dooley and Cutter and Hank had all quietly removed themselves to the far side of the kitchen and were doing very small, unnecessary tasks there with their backs mostly turned. She appreciated that. "You got turned around," she said to Silas. She was keeping him talking because that was what you did. You kept them talking. "The drift came up on the west side," he said. His voice was rough. "I thought the fence line was further right." "It probably moved. Snow does that." "I know snow does that." A pause. "I've been ranching for 17 years. "And yet," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, which she took as a good sign. "And yet," he agreed. She handed him the warm water, not coffee, not yet. Water first. He drank it without argument, which told her he felt worse than he was going to admit, because Silas Granger argued about things as a default. "Your hands," she said. "Can you feel them?" He flexed them. The left one was giving him trouble. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes. "Coming back," he said. "Tell me when you have full feeling." "Eliza." He said her name with a particular flatness, the flatness of a man who wanted to establish that he was fine. "Tell me when you have full feeling," she said again. Same tone, no adjustment. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She held his gaze. "Fine," he said. She checked on Rosie. The baby had been watching all of this from her position on the folded blanket in the corner with an expression of deep concern that was probably just because everyone else's faces had looked concerned, because that was how babies worked. Eliza crouched down and smoothed Rosie's hair, and Rosie grabbed her finger and examined it carefully and seemed to decide everything was acceptable. When she straightened up, Silas was watching her do it. She went back to the stove. There was still a ranch to feed, storm or no storm. The world had not paused for the last hour. He said quietly, and she almost missed it under the wind, "Thank you." She kept her back to him. "You'd have done the same." "I didn't get the chance. You handled it. Hank and Cutter found you. You told them what to look for, and where, and in what order." Another pause. "I heard you from outside." She turned around. He was looking at her with the full open version of whatever expression he usually kept mostly closed, and it lasted only a second before he put it away again, but she had seen it, and she knew what it contained. And she turned back to the stove because neither of them was ready for whatever came after seeing something like that. "Eat something," she said. "I'll have proper food up in 20 minutes. He ate. He stayed at the kitchen table while the other men ate too, which was not normal for him. He usually took his plate and went elsewhere. But he stayed, and nobody commented on it, and the storm pressed against the walls, and the kitchen was loud with the noise of men who had survived something uncomfortable together and were quietly grateful about it. The blizzard lasted 4 days. 4 days of drifts and cold, and the particular psychology of people confined together by weather. The cabin fever set in around day 2, when Dooley and a hand named Reed got into an argument about something so minor that Eliza never got a clear account of what it had actually been about, and she had to physically put herself between them and use the voice she normally reserved for situations requiring immediate attention. "Enough," she said. "Both of you. Right now." They stopped. Men generally stopped when Eliza used that voice. She had learned it from necessity, from 11 years of kitchens where at least half the people in them were having a bad day at any given time. She set them to useful work on opposite sides of the building, and they stayed separated, and by day 3 they had mostly forgotten they'd been angry. Silas managed the confinement by not managing it, by ignoring it in himself completely, by working on whatever could be worked on inside, by being relentlessly useful in the way of a person who understands that stillness is the enemy. He repaired 3 pieces of equipment. He inventoried the feed situation and made calculations. He sat at the table in the evenings with the ranch accounts, and on the second night Eliza sat across from him with her own records, and they worked in silence for an hour. And it was the most comfortable silence she had spent with another adult in as long as she could remember. "You're good with numbers," he said at one point without looking up. "My father was an accountant," she said. "Before he wasn't." He glanced up at that. "Before he wasn't?" "He made a series of decisions," she said. "The accounting career was one of the early casualties." A pause. "And your mother?" "Gone when I was 11. She said it the way you said things you had long since processed, evenly, without the original weight. It was just Clara and me after that." He was quiet. She knew he was thinking about Clara, about what the existence of Clara in the past tense meant, about the chain of events that had brought Eliza Rowan and one baby to his door in a storm. "She sounds like she was someone worth missing," he said. It hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Not because it was a large thing to say. It wasn't. It was small, actually, simple. But because it was accurate. Because Clara had been worth missing, and most people skirted around the fact of her being gone without addressing the fact of who she had been. "She was ridiculous," Eliza said, and her voice only caught slightly. "She laughed at everything. Inappropriate timing. You'd be in the middle of something serious, and she'd find the one absurd element of it, and just—" She stopped. "She was ridiculous, and she was the best person I knew." Silas nodded once. He didn't say anything else, which was exactly right, and she was grateful for it. Rosie, between them in her basket, had fallen asleep with her mouth slightly open and her arms spread wide in the posture of someone who had given the day everything they had. On the 4th day, the storm broke. It didn't end gracefully, it just stopped, the way Wyoming weather did things, abruptly and without apology, and left behind a world that was entirely white and entirely still, and so bright when the sun hit it that you couldn't look at it directly. The men went out to assess the damage, and it was significant but manageable. 2 fence sections down. 1 outbuilding with a partially collapsed roof on the snow side, which was not unexpected and had been prepared for. The cattle in the north pasture were stressed but present and accounted for. Silas stood on the porch in the morning light after the storm and looked at all of it with the expression of someone doing a very large calculation and finding the result acceptable. He had gotten his color back. His hands were fully functional. He had not complained once in 4 days about any of it, which was either admirable or deeply problematic depending on how you looked at it. Eliza brought him coffee on the porch because she was going to the doorway anyway, and it was already poured. He took it without comment. They stood there for a moment, both looking out at the white. "We were lucky," he said. "The structure held," she said. "The cattle held. Your men held." A pause. "That's not luck, that's work." He looked at her sideways. "You sound like someone who argues with credit when it's given." "I sound like someone who knows the difference between luck and preparation." He drank his coffee. "You could have left," he said. "When it started, you had time to get to Burnt Creek before it hit." "With Rosie in an open wagon in a coming blizzard," she said. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. He was looking at the snow. "I meant," he said carefully, "that not everyone would have stayed and handled it the way you did." "I handled it because it needed handling." "Eliza." He turned to look at her directly, which he did rarely enough that when he did, it had a particular weight to it. "I know. I know you do things because they need doing. I know that's how you operate. I'm saying that the particular way you did it—" He stopped, the 1-second pause longer than usual. "It mattered, to me." The cold air was very still around them. Behind her in the kitchen, she could hear Rosie waking up, the preliminary sounds of a baby opening negotiations with the morning. "All right," Eliza said. "All right?" "Yes." She turned to go back inside. "I heard you." She heard him exhale behind her. Not quite a laugh, not one. The legal document arrived on a Thursday in January. It came with the regular supply wagon from Burnt Creek, tucked between a package of flour and a letter from a cattle broker that Silas had been expecting. It was addressed to Eliza Rowan, care of Granger Ranch, and the name in the upper left corner of the envelope was Whitmore and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Eliza did not open it immediately. She held it and looked at the return address and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the January temperature. She knew the name Whitmore, not personally, but Clara had mentioned it once in the last weeks of her illness, in a conversation Eliza had tried to have and Clara had tried not to, about Rosie's father and his family and what they might want. "They'll want the land," Clara had said. "His grandfather left it to him. It goes to Rosie if he doesn't have other heirs. They know that. Can they take it from her?" Clara had looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is ill and tired and has done too much thinking about too many things. "Not if she has someone to fight for her," she said. "That's why I'm asking you." Eliza had said yes without hesitation. She hadn't known then what yes would actually require. She opened the envelope. The language was legal and formal, and she had to read it twice, but the substance was clear. The Whitmore firm represented Gerald and Constance Hadley, who were the paternal uncle and aunt of Rosie's deceased father, Robert Hadley. They were petitioning for legal guardianship of one Rose Clara Hadley, age 8 months, on the grounds that an unmarried woman of uncertain financial standing was an unsuitable guardian, and that the child's inherited land holdings required proper oversight by blood relatives. Blood relatives. As if blood were the only thing that made a family. As if the woman who had been there every night for 8 months, who had learned every sound Rosie made and what it meant, who had gone without sleep and gone without money and gone without complaint because a dying woman had asked her to, as if none of that counted against the simple fact of shared blood with people who had never laid eyes on the child. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that later when she thought about it. Her hands were steady, and she read the document through to the end, and then she folded it carefully and held it and looked out the kitchen window at the January sky. She heard Silas come in from outside. She didn't turn around. She heard him stop. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. He had learned to read her back, or the particular way she was standing. She held the document out behind her. She heard him cross the kitchen and take it, and then silence while he read. The silence that followed the reading was different from his normal silences. It was the silence of a man processing something that had made him angry, who was taking the time to process it correctly before he spoke. "Gerald Hadley," he said, finally. "You know him?" "Of him. He's a landman, buys property in distress, sells it at profit. He's done it 3 times that I know of in this county." He paused. "He doesn't want the child. He wants what the child owns." "I know. Have you got the documentation? The original agreement with your sister, whatever was drawn up?" "Clara was sick," Eliza said. "There wasn't time for lawyers. It was a spoken promise." Another silence. "A spoken promise," Silas said. "Yes. That won't hold up against a Cheyenne law firm." "I know that too." She turned around. He was looking at this document with an expression she recognized now as the one that preceded him deciding something definitively. The look of a man moving a piece on a board. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "They're requesting a hearing, 40 days. He looked up. "Eliza, I'll contact James Alderman in Laramie," he said. "He's the best family law attorney I know of in the state. We'll have him file a response before the month is out." She stared at him. "That will cost—" "I know what it costs. Silas, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask." He set the document on the table. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. Alderman files the response. We gather what documentation we can, testimony from witnesses who can speak to your care of the child, records from the past months. We build a case." He paused. "And I'm going to Cheyenne." "When?" "End of the month. Before the hearing is scheduled." He looked at her with the full open version of his expression again, and this time he didn't put it away. "I have things to say in person that carry more weight than paper." Eliza looked at him for a long time. She had promised herself at the beginning that she was not going to need anyone, that she was going to handle this the way she handled everything, by being adequate to it herself, by not requiring rescue. But this was not rescue. She could see that, looking at him. This was something else, something that didn't have a clean word for it, the way people who had been through something together stood on the other side of it and understood that they were no longer entirely separate. "Why?" she asked. Because she needed to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment. "Because Rosie is going to take her first steps in my kitchen," he said, "and I intend to be there when she does." Another pause. "And because I can't—" He stopped. The longest pause she had ever counted from him. "Because I don't want to see this place go back to what it was." It wasn't everything. She knew there was more that he hadn't found the way to say yet, and she knew that he knew she knew, and that the knowing was going to have to be enough for right now. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. Rosie, from her corner, chose this moment to pull herself upright using the leg of the kitchen table, which she had been working on for 3 days, and stood there on unsteady legs with an expression of absolute astonishment at her own achievement, looking from Eliza to Silas and back again, as if demanding that they witness it. They were both looking. They had both stopped entirely and were looking at her. Rosie held on for 4 seconds. Then she sat down hard on the kitchen floor and looked at them both with an expression that said she was prepared to do it again. Neither Eliza nor Silas spoke for a moment. Then Hank appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently come in for coffee without anyone noticing, and looked at Rosie on the floor, and then at Silas, and then at Eliza. "Told you last week she was close," he said. He poured his coffee and left. Eliza looked at the document on the table. She looked at Rosie, who was already hauling herself upright again with the focused determination of someone who had found something worth doing. She looked at Silas, who was watching Rosie with an expression that was entirely unguarded for once, entirely undefended, the face of a man who had forgotten for a moment to be careful. She picked up the document and folded it and held it. 40 days. She had turned a hostile kitchen into a home in 1 night. She had fed 12 men through a 4-day blizzard. She had held this child in this place together through everything Wyoming and everything human had put against her since October. 40 days was enough time. It had to be. James Alderman arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after Silas had sent the wire to Laramie. He was not what Eliza had pictured. She had pictured someone imposing, someone with the particular gravity that expensive legal work seemed to require. What arrived instead was a compact man in his 50s with a neat gray beard and the slightly distracted air of someone who was always working on 3 problems simultaneously. He came in from the cold, accepted coffee, looked at Rosie with the brief assessing glance of someone who understood that the child was the center of gravity in this situation, and then sat down at the kitchen table and opened his case. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning. Don't edit for me. Don't decide what's important. Everything." So Eliza told him. She told him about Clara and about the fever and about the promise and about the 14-hour wagon ride and about Rosie's father, Robert Hadley, who had died 8 months before Rosie was born in a horse accident that had nothing to do with anyone's fault, who had loved Clara genuinely if briefly, who had never known his daughter existed. She told him about the land, the parcel in eastern Wyoming that Robert's grandfather had left him, and that passed to Rosie as the only direct heir. Alderman listened without interrupting. He took notes in handwriting that was very small and very precise. When she finished, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked at her. "The Hadleys have a filing attorney in Cheyenne named Preston," he said. "He's competent, which means this is going to be a real fight, not a formality. The grounds they're using, your unmarried status, financial uncertainty, those have weight with certain judges, particularly in this district." He paused. "What else do we have?" "What do you mean, what else?" she said. "In your favor. Character witnesses, evidence of stable care, community standing." He looked at Silas, who had been standing against the far wall with his arms crossed since Alderman arrived. "Yours will matter. A man of property vouching for her situation changes the calculation." "Then he has it," Silas said. Alderman looked at him for a moment with the eyes of a man who is very good at reading rooms. "There may be questions about the nature of the arrangement here," he said carefully. "A single woman living at a working ranch, employer and employee. The Hadley's attorney will use that if he can." "Let him try," Silas said. "Silas!" Eliza turned to look at him. "He means it will be used to imply something about my character. I know what he means." "And?" Silas looked at her with the kind of directness she had come to understand was his version of saying a great deal. "And I said, let him try." Alderman watched this exchange with the neutral expression of a man filing information. He made a small note. "I'll need sworn statements from witnesses who can speak to the child's care and welfare. Ranch hands, anyone from town who has had meaningful contact. The more credible, the better." He closed his case. "I'll file the response by end of week. That buys us time and establishes that this isn't going to be uncontested." He stood and looked at Eliza. "You did the right thing, staying in one place. Mobility would have hurt you. The stability here is actually your strongest argument." After he left, Eliza stood in the kitchen for a long moment. She had known it was serious. She had understood intellectually that the Hadleys were a real threat and not a minor inconvenience. But hearing Alderman say the word fight with the flat certainty of someone describing a condition rather than a possibility had made it concrete in a way the legal document alone had not. "Hey!" Silas's voice behind her, not loud. He used his voice quietly when he meant something specifically. She turned around. "We're going to handle this," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know what we have on our side, and I know what they have on theirs, and I know the difference." She looked at him. "What do they have?" "A lawyer and money and a judge. They may or may not have met socially." He paused. "What we have is the truth, and 11 men who would walk into a courtroom and say exactly what they saw happen here for the last 3 months. 12, Hank said from the hallway. Neither of them had known he was there. Hank came into the kitchen with the unhurried movement of a man who was precisely where he had intended to be. 12 men, he said, counting me. He poured himself coffee. And Mrs. Pierce, if you can get past the fact that she talks too much. She saw you with that baby. She'd say so. Eliza thought about Mrs. Pierce, who had come to the door to deliver opinions and stayed to eat soup and left with something she hadn't arrived with, some altered version of the judgment she'd brought. She might, she said. She will, Hank said, with the certainty of someone who understood the social architecture of small communities better than most. People like her, they gossip, but they don't lie under oath. Different thing entirely. He took his coffee and went, as was his custom, and left the information behind him like a chair pulled up to the right position. The next 2 weeks were a different kind of work. Eliza had spent 3 months learning how to run a kitchen and raise a child and earn a place in a world that hadn't initially offered her one. The work of building a legal case turned out to use completely different muscles, and they were muscles she hadn't known she had. Alderman sent written questions. She answered them at the kitchen table in the evenings, writing in longhand, and Silas sat across from her, sometimes working on his own correspondence to Alderman, and sometimes just present in the way he had become present, which was consistently and without announcement. The ranch hands gave their statements one by one to a notary who came out from Burnt Creek. Eliza was not in the room for any of it, which Alderman had advised, but she heard afterward, through Hank and through the general permeability of a house where 12 people lived in close proximity, what they said. Dooley had apparently talked for 40 minutes about the morning Rosie had held his finger and the look on that baby's face and the way Miss Eliza always knew what was happening with the child before the child could even fully express it. The notary, according to Dooley, had at one point put down his pen and just listened. Tommy Briggs had been characteristically brief. He had said that Eliza Rowan was the most competent person he had encountered in his 23 years of life, that she had figured out his dietary difficulty without being asked and had fixed it without embarrassing him, and that anyone who wanted to separate that woman from that baby was not someone whose judgment he trusted on any other subject either. Hank's statement, by all accounts, had been the one that mattered most. Hank had 14 years on this ranch. He had known Margaret Granger. He had watched what happened to this place after her death, and he had watched what happened when Eliza arrived, and he apparently made that comparison in terms that were factual and devastating and did not require any embellishment because the facts themselves were sufficient. Cutter, when asked how he would characterize Eliza Rowan's fitness as a guardian, had said, "When I came in from the cold with my hand going bad, she fixed it. When the boss came in half frozen, she fixed that too. She fixes things. That's the only way I know how to put it. She fixes what's broken, and she keeps what's working, and that baby of hers is the best-tended child I have ever seen in my life, and I grew up with 6 sisters." Eliza learned this secondhand and went to stand in the cold outside the kitchen door for about 3 minutes by herself, looking at the January sky, before she went back in and started the supper. The Cheyenne hearing was set for the first week of February. Silas left for Cheyenne on a Monday with Alderman, who had come back to collect him. He stood in the kitchen the morning of his departure in his good coat, which Eliza had noticed was a different coat from his working coat and was the coat of a man who understood that some situations required a different presentation of himself. He looked at Rosie, who was on the floor practicing the standing maneuver she had now elevated to an art form, pulling up and letting go and sitting down and pulling up again with the systematic persistence of someone who understood that the goal was to stop needing the furniture. "I'll be back by Thursday at the latest," he said. "I know," Eliza said. She was at the stove. She was not looking at him because looking at him this morning felt like it would cost her something, and she had already spent most of her available reserves. "Alderman thinks we're in a strong position." "You said." A pause. "Eliza." She turned around. He was looking at her with the open expression, the undefended one, and he had his hat in his hands the way men held their hats when they were working up to something. "When I get back," he said, "I'd like to do... There are things I haven't said that I should say." He stopped. "I'd like the chance to say them." She looked at him for a moment. "You'll have the chance," she said. Something in him settled, a slight adjustment in his shoulders. He nodded once. He put his hat on. He looked at Rosie one more time, and Rosie looked back at him with the calm assessment she gave everyone she had decided was hers, and then he went out. Eliza turned back to the stove. Behind her, Hank came through the door. "He'll do fine in Cheyenne," Hank said. "I know he will. He's not good at talking about himself, but he's very good at talking about what he believes." "Hank." "Yes?" "I know." A pause. "Right," Hank said, and got his coffee and left. The 3 days Silas was gone were the longest Eliza had spent on the ranch since the first night of the blizzard. It was not that she couldn't function without him. She functioned. She fed 12 men 3 times a day. She managed Rosie through a difficult night on Tuesday. When the baby was unsettled and wouldn't sleep, she dealt with a supply issue when Thursday's wagon was delayed by road conditions. She functioned completely. But the kitchen felt different when he wasn't in it, and she was honest enough with herself, alone in the small room off the kitchen at night, to admit that. The wire came Wednesday evening. Hank brought it in from the hand who had ridden to Burnt Creek for provisions. He set it on the table in front of Eliza without a word and stepped back. She opened it. Hearing favorable stop. Hadley petition contested successfully. Stop. Additional testimony required from you in person. Stop. Return us. Friday. Stop. Alderman. She read it twice. Then she set it down. Then she picked it up and read it again because the first 2 times she had read it, she hadn't been entirely sure she was reading it correctly. Hearing favorable. Contested successfully. Not over. Additional testimony required, which meant there was more, which meant it wasn't finished, which meant the Hadleys had not given up, but favorable, but successfully. She became aware that Hank was watching her and that Dooley was in the doorway, and that Tommy Briggs was just behind him, and that the rest of the hands were probably within earshot because 12 people living in a house understood by some collective instinct when something significant was happening. It went well, she said. Not finished, but well. The sound that came from the assembled ranch hands was not a cheer exactly. It was more like a collective exhale followed by someone, Dooley probably, hitting something with his hand in satisfaction. Hank nodded once, with the expression of someone who had not doubted but is nonetheless relieved to be confirmed. Eliza folded the wire and held it and thought about Silas standing in a Cheyenne courtroom in his good coat, saying things he believed, being the person she had been slowly understanding him to be. She started the supper. There was always supper to start. He came back on Friday afternoon, earlier than Thursday, as he'd wired he would, and Eliza heard the horses and heard the door and heard his voice in the front room talking to Hank, and she kept working at the stove and let him come to her in his own time. He came through the kitchen doorway and she turned around and looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were both doing the thing where they were trying to read each other's faces faster than the other could read back. "Sit down," she said. "You look like you've been on a horse all day." "I have been on a horse all day." "Then sit down." He sat. She brought him coffee and then, after a moment, sat across from him because this was not a standing at the stove conversation. Rosie was in her corner, asleep for once at a reasonable time in the afternoon, and the kitchen was quiet. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The hearing had gone 2 days. The first day had been Alderman presenting the case, the statements from the ranch hands, the testimony about Eliza's care of Rosie, the documentation of the child's health and well-being, the character attestations. The judge, a man named Harrington, who Alderman had described as fair if exacting, had listened to all of it without visible reaction. The second day had been Gerald Hadley's attorney, Preston, who had been exactly as competent as Alderman had warned. He had questioned the legitimacy of a spoken deathbed promise. He had raised Eliza's unmarried status and what he called the irregular domestic arrangement at the ranch. He had presented Gerald and Constance Hadley as a married, established, financially secure couple with a home and community standing who were simply seeking to provide their deceased nephew's child with the stability she deserved. "And then," Silas said, "Alderman called me." He had been on the stand for an hour and a half. He told her the part she needed to know, that he had described the ranch, the arrangement, the 3 months he had observed Eliza with Rosie in precise and factual terms. That when Preston had tried to characterize the arrangement as irregular, Silas had said, in front of the judge and the court, that there was nothing irregular about a woman who cooked and cared for a household and raised a child with complete devotion, and that the only irregularity he could identify was the attempt to remove a thriving child from the only mother she had ever known for the purpose of controlling inherited land. Preston had objected. The judge had allowed the statement to stand. Then Harrington asked me directly, Silas said, what my interest was in the matter, why I had come to Cheyenne. Eliza looked at him. What did you say? He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee mug. I told him the truth, he said. I told him that Eliza Rowan had come to my ranch with nothing but competence and determination and a promise she intended to keep, and that in 3 months she had made it into something I didn't know it could still be. He paused. I told him I had a personal interest in her welfare and in Rosie's welfare. that I intended to ask her to remain at the ranch permanently, that it was my intention to make the arrangement considerably less irregular. The kitchen was very quiet. "You said that," Eliza said. "In court?" "Yes." "To a judge?" "Yes." "Before you said it to me." He looked up. There was something in his expression that was unusual. Not quite sheepish, but adjacent to it, the expression of a man who had done something in the correct order and was now realizing the order might have been debated. "I thought the situation required clarity," he said. "The situation," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the February wind was doing its quieter work against the walls of the house, the winter sound that was getting incrementally less savage as the season turned its face slowly toward something else. "And what did the judge say?" she asked. "He said he would require your testimony as well. Your account of the arrangement with your sister and your care of the child. He scheduled it for 3 weeks from now." Silas set down the mug. And then he told Preston that in his view the Hadley petition presented insufficient grounds for removing a child from a stable and clearly loving situation, and that absent compelling new evidence, he was inclined to dismiss it. Eliza breathed. "Inclined?" she said. "Not certain. He wants your testimony. He wants to see you." "Then he'll see me." "Alderman thinks your account of Clara, of the promise, of everything since he thinks that closes it." He paused. "I think so too." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the full, open version of himself, not the careful, edited version, the actual man underneath the 14-hour days and the crossed arms and the 1-second pauses. And she thought about what Hank had told her, about what was broken. And she thought about how things that were broken were not the same as things that were gone. "You said you had things to say," she said. "When you got back." "Yes." "Then say them." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then at her, and he said without the pause this time, without any hesitation at all, "I don't want you to leave. I don't want Rosie to leave. I want to know if you would consider, if there is any possibility that you would want—" He stopped, tried again. "I am not good at this. I know I'm not good at this. But I know what this place was before you, and I know what it is now, and I know which one I want it to be, and I know which one I want to be, and that requires you to be here." He was looking at her steadily, with the expression of a man who has said the difficult thing and is now waiting for the ground beneath him to either hold or not. She thought about the first night, the storm, the way he had said that and meant Rosie, and the anger that had moved through her. She thought about the shelf, the firewood, the herbs in the cloth bag at 4:30 in the morning. She thought about him standing on a porch in Cheyenne in his good coat, saying things he believed in front of a judge and a court because the situation required clarity. She thought about Clara, who would have found all of this completely absurd and wonderful and would have laughed at exactly the wrong moment. "You proposed to me in a courtroom," Eliza said. "Technically, I stated an intention," he said. "This is the proposal." She looked at him. "Ask me properly," she said, "if you're going to ask." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, without anything performative about it, without any language that wasn't his own, "Eliza, will you marry me?" Not a question exactly, more like a statement he was offering her the right to affirm or deny. She thought about what she needed, not what would be convenient, not what would solve the legal problem, not what would look correct to a judge in Cheyenne. What she actually needed for herself, independent of every other consideration. She thought about him at 4:30 in the morning, standing on her doorstep, holding herbs in the dark. "Yes," she said. Rosie, across the kitchen, woke up at that exact moment in the manner of a baby who has an instinct for significant occasions and pulled herself upright, holding the edge of her basket, and stood there on unsteady legs looking at both of them with her serious dark eyes, as if she had been asked for her opinion and was giving it. Silas looked at the baby for a long moment. Something moved across his face that Eliza had never seen there before. Something that was not grief and not happiness exactly, but was in the territory where both of those things lived when they stopped being separate. He got up from the table, crossed the kitchen, and crouched down in front of Rosie. Rosie examined him with her usual seriousness. Then she let go of the basket, both hands free, and stood for a full 5 seconds entirely on her own before sitting down with the decisive thump of someone who has made a point. "There," Silas said quietly, to no one in particular. Eliza watched him from the table. The kitchen was warm. Through the window, the February light was thin and pale and the color of something that intended to become something else given enough time. She had 3 weeks until Cheyenne. She had testimony to give and a case to close and a promise she intended to keep, the way she had always intended to keep it, from the moment Clara had looked at her and asked, and she had said yes without hesitation. But right now, for this moment, she let herself have it. The warm kitchen, and the man crouching on the floor, and the baby deciding to stand on her own. And all of it together meaning something she didn't have a complete word for yet, only the shape of it, only the certain knowledge that whatever the word was, it was the right one. She got up and went back to the stove. Supper wasn't going to make itself. But for the first time and as long as she could remember, she was making it not because it needed doing, but because she wanted to. Because these were her people, and this was her kitchen, and some things you did not out of necessity, but out of the particular stubbornness of a woman who had carried a baby through a storm and refused to be turned away, and had ended up, against every reasonable probability, exactly where she was supposed to be. The 3 weeks between Silas's return and the Cheyenne hearing were the strangest Eliza had spent on the ranch, and that was saying something, given that her entire time here had been a series of situations she hadn't been trained for. On the surface, nothing changed. She cooked. She cared for Rosie. She answered Alderman's written questions with the same careful precision she brought to the provision accounts. The ranch hands went about their work. The days shortened and then began almost imperceptibly to lengthen, and the kitchen remained what it had become. The warmest room in a place that was slowly remembering how to be warm throughout. Underneath the surface, everything had shifted, and they were both aware of it, and neither of them quite knew what to do with that awareness yet. She and Silas existed in a new kind of proximity. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged in the way that air gets charged before lightning. Not dangerous, just different from what it had been before, containing more potential. He still sat at the head of the table. She still moved around the kitchen in the established patterns of her work. But now when their eyes met across a room, there was no longer any pretending that it was accidental or meaningless, and the hands had noticed, she could tell, by the way they were conspicuously not noticing. Hank, characteristically, addressed it directly. "You gonna tell them," he said one morning, "or are they going to figure it out and make it into a production?" "They can figure it out," Eliza said. "Dooley's gonna cry," Hank said. "Dooley cries at the weather," she said. "That's true," Hank acknowledged, and got his coffee and went about his business. Dooley did find out, through whatever means information moved through a group of 12 men living in close quarters, and he did not cry, but he did grip Eliza's hand at the breakfast table with both of his and hold it for a moment with an expression of such sincere happiness that she had to look at the ceiling for a second to collect herself. Tommy Briggs said, "About time," with the confidence of someone who had apparently considered this outcome settled well before it was. Cutter shook Silas's hand and said nothing else, which from Cutter was a significant gesture. The one who surprised her was Reed, the hand she knew least well, a quiet man from somewhere in Nebraska who kept to himself and was reliable in the specific way that quiet, reliable men were reliable. He came to the kitchen one afternoon while she was alone and stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Eliza." She looked up. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens in Cheyenne, it won't change anything here. What you've made here." He paused, looking at the floor in the manner of someone who had rehearsed this and was now finding the rehearsal insufficient. "My mother raised 3 of us alone and nobody helped her and things went badly for her because of it. And I just—" He stopped. "I'm glad you had people to help." Then he left before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he'd gone, holding the spoon she'd been using, thinking about all the histories that walked around inside people that you couldn't see. All the particular reasons that made a man from Nebraska care about what happened to an unmarried woman and a baby on a Wyoming ranch. She thought about how you couldn't build community out of nothing, how it always started with someone deciding to act like community was possible even when the evidence was thin, and how that decision, made consistently enough, eventually became the thing itself. She went back to work. The night before Cheyenne, Eliza couldn't sleep. She was accustomed to this by now. The 4 o'clock rising had reversed itself so that she fell asleep early by most measures, and the nights felt correct to her. But this was different from the normal wakefulness of someone whose body was calibrated to work. This was the wakefulness of a person with too much at stake to trust the darkness with. She got up without waking Rosie and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, not for coffee, just for the sound and warmth of it. She sat at the table in the dark with the fire in the stove making its low sounds and the ranch quiet around her, and she thought about what she would say tomorrow. Alderman had prepared her carefully. He had asked her every question Preston was likely to ask, pushing hard enough that she understood it was practice rather than accusation. He had told her to be exact, not to elaborate when a short answer was sufficient, and not to let emotion make her imprecise. He had told her that her greatest asset was that she was telling the truth, and that truth, told clearly and without ornament, was the hardest thing to argue against. She knew all of that. What she was turning over at the kitchen table at midnight was something Alderman couldn't prepare her for, which was the account of Clara. She had told it to him clinically, in sequence, with dates and facts. She had told it to Silas in pieces, the pieces she could afford to release at any given time. She had not told it all at once, in full, to anyone, since it happened. And tomorrow, she was going to have to stand in a courtroom and tell it completely, with a Hadley family attorney sitting across from her looking for the cracks. And she was going to have to tell it without falling apart, because falling apart would make her look like someone who was managing a situation she couldn't handle rather than someone who was built for exactly this. The kitchen door, the inside one, from the hallway, opened. Silas stood there in the dark. He had clearly been asleep and was now clearly not. And he looked at her at the table and then at the kettle and then back at her. "Sit down," she said quietly. He sat. She made 2 mugs of whatever the kettle produced, which was plain hot water because she hadn't actually added anything to it. And she set one in front of him and kept one in her own hands, and they sat across from each other in the dark kitchen the way they had sat many evenings with the accounts between them. "I keep thinking about what to say tomorrow," she said. "What you told me," he said. "That's what you say." "I told you in pieces." "Then tell it in pieces tomorrow. There's no rule it has to be in order." She looked at him. "Alderman wants it sequential." "Alderman isn't standing up there." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "You know what you did for Rosie. You know why you did it. You don't need to perform that for anyone." She thought about that. "You make it sound simple." "I know it's not." He paused. "I'm saying the truth of it is simple. Whatever you said to Clara when she asked you, whatever you meant when you said yes, that's what you walk in there with. The rest of it is just language." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February night was doing its thing, which was being cold and clear and indifferent to human concerns in the way of something very old and very large. The ranch was still. In her room, Rosie was sleeping with the completeness she brought to everything. "Are you afraid?" she asked him. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out because they were in the dark, and the kitchen was quiet, and those conditions had always made honesty easier. He considered the question seriously, which was one of the things she had come to understand was specific to him, the way he took questions seriously rather than deflecting them. "I'm afraid of losing," he said. "Not for myself. For you. For Rosie." He paused. "I spent 4 years being afraid of attachment, and now I'm sitting here afraid of losing what I let myself attach to. So, she agreed. "It's better," he said. "The second kind. It means something is actually there." She looked at him across the table. The firelight from the stove was the only light, and it made everything slightly amber, slightly softened from its daytime self. And she thought about Margaret, who had sat in this kitchen, and she thought about what it meant to follow someone's absence, and she thought that it was possible to honor what came before without being consumed by it, that the two things were not in competition. "She would have liked you," Silas said. He said it the way you said something you'd been carrying for a while carefully, testing the weight of it in open air. Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. "I hope so," she said finally. "She liked people who didn't pretend," he said. "She had no patience for it." He looked at his mug. "You don't pretend." "I don't have time to." "You don't want to," he said. "That's different." They sat in the dark kitchen until the fire settled and the night started to change its quality slightly, the way nights changed around 3 in the morning, turning toward something rather than away from it. Then Eliza got up and said she should try to sleep before Rosie woke, and he said yes, and neither of them said anything else. And it was enough. The Cheyenne courthouse smelled like old wood and paper, and the particular institutional cold of buildings that were heated inadequately for their size. Eliza had been in 2 courtrooms in her life, both before she was old enough to fully understand what was happening, and she had retained an impression of them as places where the furniture was arranged to remind you of your smallness. This one conformed to the impression. High ceilings, dark paneling, a gallery that held a dozen observers, and Eliza was aware of each of them with the peripheral attention of someone who had learned that you never quite knew where a threat would come from. Gerald and Constance Hadley were seated on the far side of the room. She had imagined them a certain way, and they were not that way. Gerald Hadley was 60 and well-dressed, and had the face of a man who had been pleasant-looking once and had let the effort slide. His wife was angular and composed, and she was looking at Eliza with the expression of someone appraising a piece of property they weren't sure was worth the asking price. Eliza looked back at her evenly and then looked away first, which was a choice rather than a defeat. Alderman had prepared her for the sequence. She would testify after the Hadleys' final presentation. She would be sworn in, questioned by Alderman, then cross-examined by Preston. Judge Harrington would then hear final arguments and render a decision, which might be immediate or might take days. She watched the Hadley presentation with the focus of someone looking for cracks. Preston was smooth. He was the kind of attorney who had learned to make reasonable-sounding arguments for positions that, stated plainly, would be difficult to defend, and he was good at it. He presented Gerald and Constance Hadley as concerned family members motivated by love for a child they had never met, which might have been convincing if the land situation had not existed, and if Gerald Hadley's record of property acquisition in distressed estates had not been something Alderman had researched thoroughly and entered into the record. Gerald took the stand and spoke about family obligation and his late nephew Robert and the importance of blood connection in a child's life. He spoke well. He was the kind of man who had learned that speaking well solved more problems than speaking honestly. And Eliza sat in the gallery and listened and felt the particular cold clarity that came over her when she was in a situation requiring full attention. Constance did not testify. Preston rested. Alderman called Eliza to the stand. She walked to it the way she walked into the kitchen at 4 in the morning, with purpose, because she had work to do and she intended to do it. She sat down. She looked at Alderman and then at Judge Harrington, who was a man in his 60s with a face like old leather and eyes that looked like they had heard many things and were waiting to be surprised. Alderman started with the straightforward questions: her name, her background, her professional history, how she had come to be at the Granger Ranch. He built it in sequence as he had told her he would, laying the foundation before the structure. Then, tell the court about your sister Clara. And Eliza told it. Not in the clinical sequence she had rehearsed, in the way she had told it to Silas in pieces, across different nights and different mornings, the accumulation of truths that made up the whole. She told it the way it actually was, which was not a clean story with clean edges, but a true one. The way Clara had been ridiculous and wonderful, the way the fever had come fast, the way the last conversations had the quality of things said under pressure, compressed, and therefore more precise than ordinary speech. She told about the promise and what she understood when she made it, and what she had found out since about what it actually required. She was not falling apart. She could feel that she was close to it, in the vicinity of it, but she was not there, and she concentrated on Alderman's face and on being precise, and on the knowledge that Rosie was back at the ranch in Hank's capable and willing care right now, currently probably investigating something she shouldn't, and that this was the last thing between her and the rest of the life she intended to have. Preston's cross-examination was professional and fairly brutal. He questioned the validity of a spoken promise made under emotional duress. He returned to her unmarried status and her financial dependence on an employer. He asked whether it was possible that her attachment to the child was genuine, but her ability to provide for her independently, absent her current employment, was questionable. It was the last question she had been waiting for. "You're asking," she said, "whether I could provide for Rosie on my own." "That's correct," Preston said. If I lost this position tomorrow, Eliza said, I would find another one the next day. I have supported myself since I was 16 years old. I have never been without work because I don't allow myself to be, and I have a skill that is needed everywhere people need to eat, which is everywhere. She paused. What I can't replace is 9 months of knowing that child's every sound and every need and every fear. What the Hadleys cannot provide is a single morning of the life she has already had. You can question my finances. You cannot question what Rosie knows, which is that when she cries, I come, and when she is sick, I stay, and when she looks up from the floor, I am there. That is not a financial arrangement. That is a family. The courtroom was quiet. Preston looked at his papers. He asked 2 more questions that were smaller than the ones before them, and then he sat down. Alderman rose for one final question. Miss Rowan, he said, if the court were to grant the Hadley petition, if Rosie were removed from your care, what would that mean for her? She had thought about how to answer this. She had considered the legal language, the measured clinical response. She had decided against it. It would mean, she said, that the last thing Clara did before she died was ask someone to protect her daughter, and that the courts decided that promise didn't matter. It would mean that a child who has never known a single day without me would suddenly have none of me. It would mean that 2 people who have never held her or fed her or sat with her through a sick night would have legal authority over her life because they share blood with a man she never met. She looked at the judge. I'm not saying they're bad people. I don't know enough about them to say that. I'm saying they're strangers. And Rosie doesn't need strangers. She has a family. Judge Harrington looked at her for a moment. His face gave nothing away. He wrote something. Thank you, Miss Rowan, he said. You may step down. She stepped down. She walked back to her seat beside Alderman. Silas was seated directly behind the bar, and as she passed him, she did not look at him, but she felt his presence with the specific awareness she had developed for him over months, the particular frequency of him, and she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Final arguments took 40 minutes. Preston argued well, Alderman argued better, and he used one line near the end that Eliza had not heard in the preparation and that landed in the courtroom with the weight of something definitive. The Hadley family has demonstrated an interest in this child's inheritance. They have not demonstrated an interest in this child. Then it was quiet. Judge Harrington looked at his papers for a long moment. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the Hadleys. I've heard considerable testimony in this matter over 2 hearings, he said, and I want to address something directly before I render my decision. The law in this territory has not always been constructed with the understanding that family is sometimes built rather than born. It is assumed that blood is the primary credential. I have found, in 30 years on the bench, that this assumption is frequently incorrect. He paused. Gerald Hadley was very still. The petition for guardianship filed by Gerald and Constance Hadley is dismissed, Judge Harrington said. The child Rose Clara Hadley will remain in the custody and care of Eliza Rowan. I am further directing that a formal guardianship document be drawn up and executed within 30 days, establishing Miss Rowan's legal status as the child's guardian, which will provide protection against future petitions of this nature. He looked at Eliza over his papers. I hope she grows up knowing someone fought for her this hard, he said. Then he looked at his next file and the room began to move around her. She was not sure exactly what happened in the next few minutes. She was aware of Alderman's hand on her arm, of Silas coming through the bar, of Preston gathering his papers on the far side of the room with the contained manner of a professional absorbing a loss. She was aware of Gerald Hadley standing, of Constance touching his arm, of them both leaving without looking at her. She was aware of Silas standing in front of her. Eliza, he said. I heard him, she said. Are you all right? She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. She was shaking slightly, she realized, a fine tremor in her hands that was the delayed response of a body that had been held at attention for too long. She was also, underneath that, something she didn't have an exact word for. Not relief, exactly, though it contained relief, not happiness, though it contained that too. More like the feeling of a structure that has been under pressure for a very long time, finally being allowed to simply stand. Yes, she said. I think so. She looked at her hands. I need a minute. Take it, he said. She took it. She sat in the emptying courtroom and breathed and let the shaking run its course. And then she straightened up and looked at Alderman, who was packing his case with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had done his job correctly. Thank you, she said to him. You made the case yourself, he said. I just arranged the furniture. He shook Silas's hand, tipped his hat to Eliza, and left them alone in the courtroom. Silas sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was different. She was aware of the warmth of him, the solid, specific weight of his presence next to her in the row of wooden chairs. She's ours, Silas said. Quietly, not to the room, just to her. The word landed somewhere central in Eliza's chest and stayed there. Ours. Not mine, not hers, not legally complicated. Ours, in the plain declarative way of someone who understood what the word actually contained. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. Let's go home, he said. They rode back to the ranch through weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Too warm for snow, too cold for comfort, the particular ambivalence of Wyoming in the turning weeks between February and March. Eliza watched the landscape move past and felt something settle in her that had not been settled since before Clara's fever, or maybe longer than that, maybe since her mother went at 11 and left her responsible for Clara and for herself in a world that had not arranged itself to make that easy. She had been holding things together since she was 11 years old. She was good at it. She had gotten so good at it that she had almost stopped being able to tell the difference between holding things together and living. This felt different. This felt like living. When they came up the road to the ranch, there were 3 hands visible. Dooley near the barn, Reed by the outbuilding, Tommy on the porch. And when they saw the wagon coming, they all stopped what they were doing, and Dooley shaded his eyes against the gray light. And then Eliza stood up in the moving wagon while Silas was pulling the horses to a stop, and she held up one hand, the simple gesture of a person with good news. Dooley sat down on whatever he'd been standing next to. Reed put his hands on the top of his head. Tommy Briggs said something she couldn't hear from the distance that from the shape of his mouth seemed to be exactly what he'd said before, which was about time, applied to a different but equally appropriate occasion. Hank was in the kitchen with Rosie when they came inside. Rosie was on the floor with 3 wooden spoons arranged around her in a configuration that suggested either a game or a small ceremony, and she looked up when the door opened and found Eliza's face, and did what she always did, which was produce the specific expression of a child who has checked the attendance and found it complete. "How is she?" Eliza asked. "Better company than most adults," Hank said. He was looking at Eliza's face, reading what was on it. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that was so uncharacteristic on Hank's face that it was almost startling. "Good?" he asked. "Good," she said. He nodded once. He looked at Silas. He looked back at Eliza. "I'll tell the others," he said, and went out. Eliza crossed the kitchen and picked up Rosie, who accepted this with the regal tolerance of someone who had been managing fine but was prepared to concede that being held was acceptable. She held the baby against her chest and stood in the kitchen and felt Rosie's weight and warmth and the small, specific sounds of a child who is entirely at ease, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the whole accumulation of it, for a moment. Silas was watching her. When she looked up, he didn't look away. "She doesn't know," Eliza said. "What happened today, what it means." "She will," he said. "Someday." "What do I tell her when she's old enough to ask?" He thought about it. "The truth," he said. That her mother loved her enough to ask someone to fight for her, and that the someone did. Eliza looked at him. "And you? What do I tell her about you?" He came across the kitchen. He stood in front of her and Rosie both, and he put his hand briefly, lightly, against Rosie's back, just for a second, just the warmth of it. And then he looked at Eliza. "Tell her I asked for a cook," he said, "and I got considerably more than I bargained for." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, coming out fully when she hadn't seen it coming. Rosie startled at the sound and then, in her reliable way, laughed too, because laughing was contagious and she had learned this and used it liberally. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the ranch was doing its ordinary afternoon work. The sounds of men and animals and the particular ongoing business of a place that had decided to be alive. They married in April. Not because April was particularly romantic in Wyoming. It wasn't. April was mud and unpredictable weather and the renewal of work deferred by winter. But because aldermen had finalized the guardianship papers in mid-March, and the legal clarity felt like a door opening and they walked through it. The ceremony was in the yard because the kitchen was too small and the bunkhouse was too dismal, and neither of them wanted anything formal, which Eliza suspected was the one aspect of wedding planning on which she and Silas were in complete and total agreement. A circuit preacher came through on a Thursday, which was not a particularly ceremonial day of the week, but they weren't ceremonial people, and Thursday suited them. All 12 hands were there. Hank stood slightly apart from the others in the way he did, watching the proceedings with an expression that contained everything he was not going to say out loud about what this meant, what he had watched these two people become to each other and to the place they were all standing in. Dooley cried. Hank had been right about that. He made no effort to conceal it, and when Tommy raised an eyebrow at him, he said, with complete dignity, "Shut up, Tommy," and that was the end of the discussion. Mrs. Pierce came. She had been on the witness list aldermen had assembled. She had given a statement about Eliza's care of Rosie, with a directness and specificity that had apparently impressed the notary considerably. And she arrived at the ceremony in her good hat with an expression that suggested she had decided to have a positive view of this event and would defend it if challenged. She sat next to Reed during the ceremony, and afterward he said something to her that Eliza didn't catch, and she laughed, and that seemed like something worth noting. The ceremony itself was brief, which suited them. Words were said, responses were given, none of it was elaborate, and all of it was meant. And when it was done, Silas looked at Eliza with an expression she had seen only a handful of times, completely unguarded, everything in it. And then he looked down at Rosie, who Hank was holding because they had made practical rather than traditional arrangements. And Rosie was looking at the assembly of people around her with the satisfied expression of someone who had known all along that this was where everyone was supposed to be. The meal that followed was the best thing Eliza had ever made, and she said so to no one in particular while she was making it, and nobody argued. It took time after to find the new normal. That was the part nobody talked about in stories, the afterward, the adjustment to a changed situation that you had chosen and wanted and were still getting used to. There were mornings when Silas and Eliza talked past each other, when the habits of their separate selves collided with the requirements of a shared one. There was one argument in May about the provision ordering that was actually about something else, which they both knew and neither fully said, and they resolved it badly and then better and then moved on. He had silences that she sometimes misread. She had a precision that sometimes felt like criticism when it wasn't. They were not perfect. The ranch was not perfect. Wyoming did not become less brutal because two people had decided to face it together. But the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and it was always warm. Rosie took her first fully independent steps on a Tuesday morning in May, with no furniture involved, crossing 3 feet of kitchen floor with the expression of someone who had been planning this for weeks and was now executing at full confidence. She went from Eliza to Silas, which was not staged, which was just where the walking took her, and Silas caught her under the arms and lifted her up, and Rosie looked at him from this new height with the expression she had been giving him for months, the attendance-taking expression, the one that said she had checked and everything was accounted for. Hank watched from the doorway. He had come in for coffee, which he could have gotten any number of times in the last 10 minutes, but which had not quite happened yet. 14 years on this ranch, he said to nobody in particular. And I'll be honest, I didn't see that coming. He poured his coffee. Any of it. He went out. The ranch changed in the way things changed when a place remembered what it was for. Not suddenly, not in any single definable moment, but in the accumulation of days that were different from the days before them, in the small ongoing evidence of a household that had expanded its definition of itself. Neighboring ranchers came for reasons that had nothing to do with cattle or fence lines. The Aldrich family came in June, and Mrs. Aldrich, who had said what she'd said through the walls in October, sat at Eliza's table and ate her food with the expression of someone who had since revised certain conclusions and was demonstrating the revision through appetite. People talked about Granger Ranch differently, not about its acreage or its cattle numbers, about its table, about the woman who ran the kitchen and the man who ran the land and the child who ran between them, fearless and certain of her footing in a way that children were certain when they had never had reason to doubt the ground under them. That certainty was not an accident. Eliza knew that. It was the result of every 4 o'clock morning, every night spent in a chair next to a sick baby. Every decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. It was the result of Silas repairing a shelf without being asked and leaving firewood in the dark and standing in a Cheyenne courtroom saying things he believed because the situation required clarity. It was the result of 12 men who showed up and said yes when asked and meant it. You didn't build that kind of certainty in a child by accident or by blood. You built it by showing up. By the daily practice of choosing someone and choosing them again, and continuing to choose them when it was difficult, which it always was, which was not a design flaw but the actual nature of it. There was a particular evening in June that Eliza returned to in her mind, later, as the image that held all of it. The supper was done, and the table was cleared, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse in the slow way they moved on good evenings, without hurry, the way men moved when they had no complaints about where they'd been. Silas was on the porch doing the last check of the day, looking over the land with the evening light going amber on everything the way it did in June, turning the ordinary into something that looked like it meant something. Eliza stood in the kitchen door and watched him. Rosie was at his feet, sitting in the dirt of the porch floor with complete satisfaction, examining something she'd found there, a pebble, or a stick, or some other object of obvious importance, with the focused curiosity she brought to the world, which was relentless and undimmed by familiarity, because everything was still new and therefore interesting. Silas looked down at her. He crouched down the way he had in the kitchen in February, the first time Rosie had stood on her own, the easy crouch of a man who had decided at some point that the distance between himself and a small child on the floor was worth covering. He said something to her that Eliza couldn't hear. Rosie looked up from the pebble and said something back. Not words yet, not quite, but with the full intention and tone of words, the shape of communication, the practice of it. He listened to her. That was the thing Eliza noticed from the doorway. He listened to Rosie the way you listened to someone you respected, with full attention, as if what she was saying was worth attending to. Rosie held out the pebble and he took it and examined it seriously and handed it back with what appeared to be a considered assessment. Rosie accepted this and returned to her study. The light went on, amber to gold to the beginning of something softer. Silas looked up and found Eliza in the doorway and held her gaze and didn't look away. She thought about the first night, the storm, the carpet bag, the word that's spoken with such flatness about the most important person in her world. She thought about how much had to happen, how many mornings and meals and hard conversations in worse weather, how much showing up was required before the word that could become the look he was giving the child on the porch floor right now. It was not a small distance. It was not a quick one. It was everything. She had carried a baby through a storm and knocked on a door she had no reason to believe would open and made herself indispensable in a kitchen that didn't want her, and she had stayed when staying was hard and fought when fighting was required and built, slowly and without blueprint, a life out of the materials that had been available to her, which had not been much, which had turned out to be enough. Not because she was exceptional, because she was stubborn and competent, and because she had made a promise and she was the kind of person who treated promises as the most binding contracts in existence, more binding than anything a lawyer could put on paper. And because, somewhere along the way, the work of keeping her promise had become the work of building her life, and those two things had turned out to be the same work all along. Eliza, Silas's voice from the porch. She stepped through the door. The evening air was mild for Wyoming, which meant it had opinions but was keeping them to itself. Rosie looked up from the porch floor when Eliza came out and made the sound she made when her attendance was complete, the small, satisfied syllable of a child who has counted everyone and found the number correct. Eliza sat down on the porch step beside Silas, not across from him, beside him, and they looked out at the land together in the way they had come to look at things, side by side, the same direction, which was forward. What did she find? Eliza asked, nodding at the pebble. A very important rock, he said. She explained it to me. And? It's gray, he said, and round, and she found it. He paused. Those appear to be the relevant qualities. Eliza looked at Rosie, who was holding the rock with both hands with the satisfaction of someone in possession of something that mattered. "She's going to keep it," Eliza said. "Probably. She keeps everything she finds. She comes by it honestly," he said. She looked at him. He was watching Rosie with an expression that was simply love, not complicated, not guarded, not the careful edited version, just the thing itself. The land stretched out in front of them in the June evening, every fence line that had needed mending and had been mended, every pasture that had come through the winter and was coming back, the ordinary and extraordinary ongoing fact of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. The warmest home on the Wyoming frontier, people were starting to say. She had heard it twice now from different mouths, said without irony, as a simple description of what the place had become. She hadn't built it alone. She needed to know that about herself, that she was someone who could accept help without it diminishing her, who could let people stand beside her without it meaning she couldn't stand on her own. She had learned that here, or relearned it, in the space that had been made by 12 men and one difficult rancher and one old hand who delivered information like firewood, in exactly the amount needed and exactly when. The pebble, according to Rosie, was important, because she had found it, because it was hers. Eliza understood that completely. Some things became yours through blood and inheritance and the arrangements of birth. And some things became yours through the harder road, the choosing, the fighting, the showing up at 4 a.m. when the easier thing was to stay where you were. Through the keeping of promises, even when the full cost of them hadn't been disclosed. Those things, the ones you had worked for and stayed for and refused to surrender, those were the ones that held. Rosie looked up from her rock. She looked at Eliza, at Silas, at the porch, at the yard and the land beyond it. Then she pushed herself to her feet. Steady, no furniture required, just her own 2 legs and her own determination. And she stood there in the June evening with the rock in her fist and the light on her face, and she looked like exactly what she was. The beginning of everything they had built, and the reason all of it had been worth it.